All right. Good morning and welcome to everyone watching our first interview series here at HPFC. I'm happy to have Derek Salvador join us this morning. I'll allow him to do the introduction in a second, but just to give you a background, Derek is a certified strength and conditioning specialist focusing specifically in football and football players. And he's also a University of Toronto lecturer, lecturing in the Department of Kinesiology and Physical Education. Good morning, Derek. Thank you for being with us today.
Good morning, Mo. How are you?
I'm excellent. Very happy to have you and looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. Me as well. Thanks for having me on here.
Perfect. Derek, if you don't mind, just before we start, I know you and I have spoken in the past and I know you very well now, but for the people who are going to watch this later, if you don't mind, just give a little bit about your background, your education, how you ended up in the world that you are and what you're doing now at U of T.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome question. It's been a long journey. Just to start off with, grew up playing the sport of soccer, and it's just something I truly enjoy, and it's something I'm very passionate about. I've really enjoyed the sport, playing the sport, being around the sport, watching the sports, supporting the sport. And so I guess for myself is when you look at this stuff is playing the game is probably what was the big thing. And then I had my first injury, like my first pretty serious injury. I fractured my ankle, and then I started going through the whole rehab process. And I thought to myself, you know what, this is really cool. Like, to be able to still be in sport even after the game is after you're done finished playing the game and stuff, to have a career in sport is pretty fascinating. And so I was always kind of really interested in the world of rehabilitation, and then basically how players were looked after outside of the pitch, on the pitch, et cetera, et cetera. And from there, it kind of started my journey, went to university, and then things started to change. I was looking at sports psychology, and then sports psychology is something that I wasn't really too into at the time. So then I tried to go back the rehab route. I ended up becoming a physiotherapy assistant, so working in rehabilitation. And the groups that I primarily worked with were ACL injuries. And the more and more I started working with ACL injuries, the more and more I started realizing that a lot of the population I was working with were young footballers. And so I started wondering, what is going on? What is happening? Why are these players getting injured? And then as I started doing more and more research, instead of looking at it from the reactive side of things, so, dealing with players after the injury, I kind of wanted to know what was happening on the front end. So like, why were these players getting injured? And so then more and more my interest started shifting more towards high performance and strength and conditioning and fitness. And so kind of this is where the journey's led me to right now. It's led me to where I am here. I own and operate a small company called Levanta Sports Performance, where we do a lot of strength conditioning, fitness training with footballers of all ages and of all abilities. And then also teaching at the University of Toronto. So part of the faculty of kinesiology and physical education. Right now I'm teaching a first-year course. So it's an introduction to observation and evaluations. So basically just start to open up the students' eyes to how people move, why they move, how the why, influences the how kind of thing. So it's been a long journey, and, it's just been something that's been really awesome.
It's fantastic because, as I said to you before, you and I seem to share a lot of similarities in our professional backgrounds. Just like you, myself, I'm a coach, but I came from the rehab world. I was working with high-performance athletes itself. And this kind of leads us to our next question here is, why are we holding this conversation? And I'll provide a little background. Derek and I met some weeks back, subsequent to one of our posts from HPFC online, which was talking about the different types of training and us having a problem with certain approaches to youth development. And specifically, we were not happy with the endorsement that TFC was giving these types of programs, thinking that those guys are supposed to be the sound of rationality. So Derek and I connected, and he had left a nice comment at the bottom of our writing there. No, not specifically commenting on any party specifically, but he kind of felt the way we did in terms of the topic we had introduced. So Derek, if you want to give a little background on that.
Yeah, it's one of these things that, it's not necessarily trying to point anyone out like you just stated. But for myself, it's just, what's very frustrating as a coach, also as a business owner, is when you see a lot of stuff that is being, put out there in the public, that is deemed either sports specific or, athlete or youth development. And it's nothing more than just party tricks or circus tricks. It kind of, rubs me the wrong way. And, it's very hard to say because, like I said, I know context is important and we need to, know that first before we can make any opinions. So, which is why I'm not going to call any particular group out. But I think the big problem is that, and you can attest to this as well, I think it's going to be a lot of education from our point of view, where we try to really help people understand, what good training is versus, people who may just not know any better, and I have to truly believe that people just don't know any better and are really trying to do it for the greater good, rather than just trying to take someone's money. And so that's why it's really hard for me to call people up because maybe they just don't know any better. But I think it's really important to just start educating parents and start educating players as to what training is, what is sports specific training. And then how does that all transfer into the game, right? Because at the end of the day, we're trying to make players better, right? And, for myself, and I probably you feel the same way, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a professional soccer player. And that didn't happen. You know what I mean? I was good enough, but not that good that I could make it. So now my dream is to see how many players I can help them achieve their dreams. How many players can I push on? How much can we help to develop to try and increase our national player pool? So I want to play a part in that. And I just think that some people go about it the wrong way, or maybe, with maybe it's not as best as it could be done. But I sincerely have to hope that their intentions are for the better. And so basically, yeah, those are my thoughts behind it. And that's kind of like where you and I started to connect and where we start to have some of these conversations and stuff.
Exactly. And the reason I use these two pictures is because essentially today's conversation is going to be to deduce whether what we call analytical training versus team specific training, which one is better when it comes to youth player development. And for example, analytical training, as you see in this picture, the girl playing with the ball with the line, when the first time I saw this contraption, I kind of thought it was really out there because this is as far as away from football as possible. In the other picture, you have players playing with teammates against defenders in a space that's constructed. So it's as closest to the game as possible. So today's conversation is going to be specifically around this topic: analytical isolated training, as you see the young lady doing with the ball, as opposed to team specific training, as you see in the second picture. So we'll head on and move on from there. And this is going to be our first kind of line of questioning for Derek. For us as coaches, as you said, the most important thing is what we do on the field. Does it translate well into the playing? So are the kids getting anything out of the training that's going to help them on Saturday, Sunday when they play the game? And the concepts of functionality, specificity, and transferability are important when it comes to training. So Derek, if you don't mind, kind of help us define these and expand on these items a little more for us.
Yeah, I guess for myself, it's that, so just like I mainly work on the physical elements of training. So for myself is that here's the thing, is that when I hear sport specific training, I think sports specific training occurs within the training environment of the sport itself. Okay. So I can't mimic what occurs in a football training session. I can't mimic what occurs in a football match. However, I can help to break down movement to a sense where I can work on mechanics, I can work on acceleration, I can work on speed, power, strength. I can work on movement quality, right, to ensure that our athletes are moving well. I can work on movement variability to try and give them more solutions to potential problems that they may incur on the field. But at the end of the day, my job has to be able to provide the athletes with tools that they can then take onto the field and execute within their sports specific sessions. So when I see strength and conditioning coaches hooking up a contraption to someone's foot and having them swing and take multiple kicks, that's great, but you know what? I don't think it's going to have much transfer into the sport itself. So I guess to try and sum it up, to keep it, simple so that way our listeners can understand, is that for me, it's that, there's got to be a functionality to the training itself. So what am I trying to set the player up for? And then how does that become specific to what they're trying to achieve on the field? And then I guess for us is the transferability is then there's that assessment to see that if what I'm trying to work on, does it now transfer into the game? Am I starting to see those things in the game? So if I'm trying to teach an athlete how to move laterally, and then we work on all these, these isolated drills, then when I watch them in their environment, are they executing? And if the answer is no, then I need to go back to the drawing board in order to, to improve that movement or to try and cue them in a different way where I can eventually start to see that on the field, right? So when I see sports-specific training, it's not necessarily sports-specific because, like that's going to occur on the field itself, right? Within the environment, because like I said, I can work on all these movements, but then all of a sudden the player has to take into consideration the ball. They have to take into consideration their teammates. They have to take into consideration their opponents, right? So all of that is, so as they're trying to execute all these movements, there's all these decisions that they're trying to make. There's communication that's got to occur amongst players, which is going to influence all of that. And so within my training environment, I can't necessarily provide my players with that. But you know what? There is a time and place for everything, right? So when I see, when I have these discussions with soccer coaches, where they do all this isolated fitness training, to me, it's like, okay, I get it. What's your purpose though? Like, can you actually achieve all this fitness while actually playing the game, right? And I think that's going to have more transfer for the players, right? So, so I guess that's the big thing too. Like, and context really matters too. I know I'm going on a bit of a rant here, but I know, I think context matters too. Like when you had your previous picture, when you see the girl with that, that contraption there where she's got the ball that comes back to her and stuff like that, there is a time and place for that, and I think there's a time and place for all this stuff. Like I said, context is king. But again, you have that, and then now the idea is, does it transfer into the actual game? So I can work on all these touches, but then all of a sudden, if I'm under pressure, or or it's the 80th minute, and then all of a sudden I'm under fatigue, can I execute these actions, properly? And if it's just repeating or just doing things based on repetition, where the execution isn't done well, then really all I'm doing is just practicing something that's being done poorly. And then when put in a pressure situation or put it into the, the relevance of the game, then all of a sudden now it doesn't transfer. So I guess for me, that is the biggest thing, is that with any type of training, whether it's football training, strength and conditioning training, it has to transfer into the game. And if it isn't, then we are either not doing a good enough job, right? Or we're just wasting we're just wasting parents and players' money and time.
Absolutely. Just like you, from a coaching perspective, the reason I had issues with some of the things that we talked about initially and the videos that I showed you is that we know football to be a very chaotic game, and the player has to find reasoning or sense out of that chaos while they're playing, while carrying out all these physical activities. So the game has all these other variables that are involved, such as the defender, the distance from the defender, the distance from the out of bounds line, how fast is the ball traveling to you. There's all these visual sensory cues that are being fed into the brain as you're playing. And while all this chaos is happening, you have to reason your way and find logic and make a decision within this environment, which is in total chaos. And our problem is, if you're doing the type of isolated training where you're playing against cones or you're playing against an inflatable doll that's flying around, this is as far away from the decisions that you need to make in football, because you're not preparing your mind for those same sensory visual stimuli that you're going to sense in the game. So yes, you might be checking your shoulder to see where the inflatable doll may be, but in a real game, an active, intelligent defender will change their pace, they'll change their speed, they'll change their angle of approach, and your brain will have to pick up all those cues before it makes a decision. So if you're not doing that type of decision making within a game situation or an environment where it's as closest to the game as you're training, then once you go into the game, then your brain won't be ready to deal with all that sensory information, and then within all that chaos to make a decision. So the reason Derek and I connected was because we felt that some trainings weren't allowing us to develop our brain the way we want, to be able to transfer those skills, as Derek said, into the game situation. And it's not just soccer training, as Derek said, even off-field strength and conditioning programs need to be functional. That means they have to be as close as to the skills and movements that you're going to reproduce in the game. They have to be specific to those movements. And if they are functional and specific, then there will be some transferability into the game. So these are some of the topics that Derek and I have been discussing a lot lately, and was part of the reason we started to connect and have this conversation. Derek, anything else you'd like to add there?
Yeah, like I said, it's one of these things where, it's always, there's always an assessment process to it, right? And I think good coaches, right, or good programs need to have an evaluation process where, even just for ourselves, and this is what I want our listeners to understand, is that, from my programming, and I can only speak for myself, it's always evaluating what we're doing, right? And so it's like, it's having a training session, and then whether it's a discussion with a player, whether it's actually watching them in their environment, there's always that assessment. And sometimes when I'm watching my players play, or when I'm working with my various teams and I see them within their training session, like for me personally, I'm not even looking at the tactics or anything like that. I'm just watching how my players move. And so what I'm trying to assess now is, what is it that I'm trying to teach them? And then is it having that transfer, like we said, into the game? And then from there, like I said, it's always that evaluation process. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. Okay, great. If it's not, what's happening, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's also getting the feedback from the player too, right? Just to make sure that we're on the right track. Because sometimes it's like, here's what I think you need to do, but then what does the player feel they need to work on as well in order to help their game get better? And I think, many times we see within even the isolated football training is that, the player is put under pressure, and then, they kind of receive a ball and play it off and stuff like that. But then, how do you put into context if the player they're trying to pass to is under pressure? So how are they playing? Are they playing the ball on the front foot? Are they playing on the back foot? Are they setting them up for success? Is that player covered where now they have to make that secondary decision? So I guess that's the big thing, is that, like with anything, a good program needs to have transfer into what the game is all about.
Exactly. And something you said interesting, from a rehab perspective, we know that if training is not functional, specific, and it doesn't have high transferability, it could actually lead to injuries when the player goes into their specific sport. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that, because like I said earlier when I was talking about my journey, I was working in rehab, and I was trying to figure out. So like I said, working with ACL population, we see a lot of ACL injuries in the game. And for me, it was like, okay, so this player has surgery, and then they go through their 6-8 months of rehab, and then the surgeon clears them for return to play, and then off they go. And so now talking to a sport coach, they're like, well, this player's been out of training for a year and a half now. Like, what am I supposed to do with them? And so for me, it was like, okay, there's a gap there that we need to work on. So now how can we work on proper return to play, protocols to ensure that now our athletes are going back, in the best shape possible, in the best position possible, to be able now to execute within that training environment. Because there's one thing to work on technique. There's one thing to work on, cutting and changing direction, but now you're introducing collisions as well. Like, players are coming in and they're tackling, etc. The ground is wet. Someone comes in for a slide tackle, you know what I mean? So there's all of that stuff there. Which is why then it led me to my path where it's like, okay, we can't just worry about, the bridging the gap. We have to look at, a proper program right from the get-go. Right. And so, you yourself being in the rehab world, one thing I heard a while ago, which was really interesting, is that I've heard the saying, training equals rehab and rehab equals training. Right. So an exercise is an exercise is an exercise, no matter, how you execute it, whether it's in a rehab setting, whether it's in a high performance setting, exercise can be progressed and regressed, but they're still the same exercises. Right. So then again, you start to think about, okay, which exercises are going to have the highest trainability or, highest, transferability, into the sport. And sometimes it isn't just about an exercise, but about the individual as well. What is it that they best need that is then going to give them the skills to take into the game? Right. And so I think that's, when you look at it from that point of view, it's the whole picture. It's that holistic approach where now it's you're looking at all elements, because we know the game is becoming more demanding. We know the game is faster. Kids are playing, even professionals are playing more games than ever now. And so for me, it's like, how can we keep these people healthy? And so if I see people, dancing around with their feet, going over lights, just for the sake of doing something like that, because it looks cool, then then to me, that's doing the player a disservice. That's setting them up for failure, right? And so the thing is that, you know, when you look at youth physical development, you know, it's a journey, right? And it isn't fancy. It isn't tricks. What it is just it's basically trying to establish fundamentals, good fundamental movement patterns, good fundamental movement skills, you know, in a variety of different settings, right? Variability, you know, how much more can we teach these kids? Because now it's not like how we were when we were younger. You know, when we were in gym class or we were outside playing all the time, it's not like that anymore. So now we have to find ways to give our athletes exposures to that, right? So now how can we make them all around athletes when they are now specializing more than ever now? And so to me, that's the big picture. But guess what? That doesn't look sexy. That doesn't look cool, right? And so all of a sudden now, you know, you see someone doing something really fancy where we're jumping on BOSUs and doing flips and kicking our feet over lights and all this stuff. Well, that looks like soccer training. No, it's not. It's not anywhere close, right? Sometimes someone just doing a proper lunge pattern or learning how to hinge or even just doing a cartwheel, like those things there are helping to develop athletes all around rather than just these gimmicks that, you know what, like I said, look cool, but you know what? For me, it's a lot of nonsense. And, you know, I hate to be discussing this or maybe it's coming across as being, you know, mean or picking on someone or arrogant in any way. But, you know, like I've seen enough of this and it's just, you know, like I don't agree with it. I think it's very, very poorly done. And I think if that's the best you can come up with, like you need to go back and get some more knowledge.
Absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, the science is very clear about these concepts of functionality, specificity, and transferability, so that at this point, we shouldn't be having arguments about what works and what doesn't work when the science speaks very clear about. I'll give you an interesting study that I came across, and it's related to what we're talking about. There was a study done showing the differing training styles of various coaches and the number of injuries they have per season. And depending on their style, some coaches had more, some coaches had less. And when you analyze their style, you understand why. Because some of the training sessions were not as close as needed to be to the game. They weren't functional, they weren't specific. And as a result, players, when they went into the game, they start picking up injuries because their bodies simply hadn't been prepared in advance. So at the end of the day, the point Derek and I are trying to make here is that when you do training, whether it's for soccer or whatever other sport you're playing, make sure that the training is functional, so it relates to what you're doing. It's specific, so it's related to football. And whatever you learn, you could take with you back to football and transfer it into the game. And as many have said, for football players, the best way to pick up some of these functionality and specific techniques and skills that they need for football is within football settings. So we'll talk more about that. We're going to move on here, Derek, and talk about one of your favorite guys, Raymond Verhage. He's a